Welcome back to the shop and to the channel. If you've been following along with my recent videos, I just got the motor put back into the K&T, and I've got the motor control circuitry all wired up and ready to go. This week I'm going to work on getting the belts attached between the motor and the drive pulley and making sure that everything mechanically is sound. Before I actually put these belts on between the motor and the driven pulley, I'm going to spin it by hand here. I just want to see if oil is in fact getting picked up by the pump, and sure enough, if it is, you can see here through the side vent hole that oil is coming up through the pipes and is washing over the gears. The next thing to go on is the drive pulley and the motor fan. This attaches to the motor shaft. There's a keyway and a key that's inside the pulley. I'm going to use this aluminum ruler to align the motor pulley with the driven pulley. Just line it up on the edge of each of them until the ruler is parallel with the edges, and that should guarantee that the belts will line up. With both pulleys now lined up, I'll use a hex key driver and a ratchet to tighten down the set screws to lock it in place. I did end up purchasing two matched V-belts from McMaster. I could have gone with just standard V-belts. Quite frankly, the manufacturing process is so good now that these are probably matched anyway. But I figure it's really not costing that much more to get matched V-belts. I'm sure I probably just threw money away, but it wasn't that much more, so why not? With the V-belts in place, I will back off on this large bolt on the motor leveling plate, and this will let gravity do some tensioning on those V-belts. There's a second bolt on the front of the motor plate that pushes down on it, capturing it basically in place, allowing me to apply just a little bit more tension on those belts. Hitting the start button here should engage the motor and the pulleys. Fingers crossed. It's good to see that it's working. It sounds great, and oil is pumping at a good clip here up into the gearbox. It's also good to see that the sight gauge is validating that the oil is pumping, so this will give me some reassurance when I'm running the machine. And here I'm going to engage the spindle at the lowest speed, and happy to see that it's running as expected. Do a quick gear change here and try it at a faster speed. One more quick test, but I don't want to do this too much because I have oil splashing out of that vent hole on the side. And lastly, I'm inserting a replacement expansion plug that I destroyed when taking this pulley and fan off during the disassembly. Just machined this out of some scrap 4140 I had on the shelf. Well, I'd like to say things ended well after that and I was able to move on, but as you can see, with the motor not in the machine anymore, that something has gone awry. You can't really see it from any of these shots because I had already started some of the cleanup, but after I was running this a little while longer, oil was pouring out of the motor bay. After doing a little digging and investigating off camera, I discovered that that oil was coming down around the conduit that leads up here to the top of the starting lever shaft. I unbolted the transmission and pulled it out just a little bit using those guide rods that I had used to install it, or tried to use to install it, and couldn't see anything. So I don't really have much of a choice but to dig into this a little bit deeper. I don't really know how deep this rabbit hole is going to take me, so I know I'm going to need to lift this shaft up a little bit to see what's around it, and before I can do that, I need to disconnect the start-stop buttons and probably pull the control wires out. I'm hoping that this won't be too drastic, so I'm going to attach a string to these wires. I'm going to pull them all the way out into the motor bay, and if my fix is easy, I can just use the string then to pull them back up. I can grab a hold of that flexible conduit now and pull it down because it's loose. It should not be this loose, and I can pull these wires all the way through, leaving the string hanging. This straight piece of pipe that's on the end here is the standpipe, or at least it looks like it's part of it. It does look like the end of it is broken. And this is what's supposed to keep that oil from coming all the way down that conduit. Well, with the start shaft up, I can pull the transmission out. I kept it on these guide rods. I've got a pair of vice grips on one of them to keep it from sliding all the way off. And now I can hopefully feel around inside there, maybe poke around with the flashlight, see if I can figure out what might be wrong here. I have my suspicions. Well, I can't pull this shaft up any higher to get at that standpipe because of this limiting pin here. So I don't have any choice but to remove the gear. It's held on with this screw that goes through a split end of the gear, and it's on there really tight. And this is a real struggle because I'm working at this at an odd angle. It's dark in there, so I have a headlight on, and of course this shaft keeps wanting to spin. So trying to get this loose has proven to be rather challenging. And to add to the challenge, half of the head of this bolt is intentionally ground off. Otherwise, it would interfere with the gears on the side of the transmission. I'm going to try to see if I can't get this to loosen up a little bit using an impact driver. Now, still taking a little bit of effort manually here, but I'd rather do this with a manual screwdriver than the impact driver. But it is backing out. And I realize these camera angles are terrible, and the lens unknowingly was dirty, but I really wanted to avoid taking this transmission all the way out. It would have meant bringing over the engine crane and finding a place to put it. I think with it just resting on these guide rods, it will be okay for the short time that it's going to be out. And if getting the screw out wasn't challenging enough, this gear is fairly well anchored onto the start shaft. It's going to take some work to get it out. I'm trying here with just a dead blow and holding up the start shaft with my other hand, but it doesn't seem to want to be budging. I have the start-stop lever wedged above with some blocks of wood to keep it lifted. So I'm using a brass drift here to try and drive it off of the end of the shaft. Well, I'm trying to give this thing some good whacks. I'm making a little bit of progress, but not very much. I'm trying not to hit it too hard. The last thing I want to do is end up breaking something, so I'm rethinking whether or not I should have taken this transmission out. Maybe it'll give me some more room. Well, I'm still making some slow progress, so I think I'm going to leave the transmission where it's at, and just keep, one little small tap at a time until this thing comes all the way off the end. We're almost there. I maybe have another inch left to go before this thing will come off, and a couple of well-placed taps here, and sure enough, it's off the end of the shaft. And unfortunately, based on what I found, this is going to be a much deeper hole. So tying that string to the wires, even though it might have been a good idea if it was simple, it was a waste of time. Well, you can see where the problem was. This standpipe here is broken completely in half. Take a little trip down this side road to kind of explain exactly what this standpipe is and what function it performs. I was going to ask the art department to come up with some really nice flashy illustrations and animation, but then it occurred to me that I don't have an art department. So instead, you're going to have to settle for what I can give you. If we could look into the side of the machine as a cutaway, we'd see that it had two large cavities. The one here at the top is where the transmission is, and the one at the bottom is where the motor goes. We'd also see there at the bottom of the transmission cavity is a small oil sump, and also the start lever shaft that has the motor control wires that go from the top of the machine into the motor cavity. If we were to turn the machine on, that oil gets pumped up and starts splashing around the inside of the transmission all over the gears, keeping them lubricated. But because of the hole between the transmission cavity and the motor cavity for the control wires, if we did nothing, the oil would leak down into that hole, getting it all over the motor, which is essentially the problem that I have now. To keep the oil from leaking through, we put another pipe into that hole that's sealed off between those two areas. And now my start shaft can go over top of that standpipe. The wires can run through, thus preventing any possibility of oil going down into that hole into the motor cavity. So if I don't want the motor area to be completely covered in oil again, I need to make a new standpipe. I picked up this piece of pipe from McMaster-Carr that we'll be using to make the new one. I also found out that the key that is supposed to key this gear to the start lever shaft was missing. So I had some 1/4 inch key stock and made a replacement for when it goes back on. The pipe that I got from McMaster is a bit long. It needs to be about 9 inches long, so I need to take about 3 inches off. I am going to turn this between centers, so I will start by facing off one end before cutting it to length. Before I can set this in between centers, I need to recut the center in the chuck. Since a 3-jaw chuck does not maintain concentricity, I need to recut this to be sure that it's concentric with the spindle. I clamped a drive dog to one end of the pipe and set it into the chuck end of the lathe. The drive dog will sit up against one of the jaws of the 3-jaw and drive the piece. I also want to back off the tailstock some so I have plenty of room for the tool post and the cutting tool. I'll start by just doing a skim cut so I can establish a good starting diameter. There's going to be a boss somewhere in the middle of the standpipe that'll be about 9/100ths of an inch in diameter. So I'm going to turn down this right side to that dimension to start. With the center boss close to the dimension, I think I might have been under by a few thousandths, I can now machine this bottom end of the standpipe. The final diameter of the bottom end of the standpipe will be 813 thousandths. I can be under by maybe a thousandths, but not any more than that, and I certainly can't be over it. This is the piece of the standpipe that goes through the hole that's between the gearbox and the motor bay. Of course, if it's too big, it's not going to fit down in the hole, and if it's too small, it's not going to do a very good job of sealing out the oil, which is why I wanted to turn this between centers. I'm going to try to sneak up on that dimension as best I can, and will test fit it in the machine. And if I need to take more off of this bottom end, I can put it back in between the centers and trust that I still have concentricity. $13. 13 and a half. I'm going to take the piece out now. I'm going to switch the drive dog to the other end of the pipe so I can machine the top end. I put a piece of flattened copper pipe underneath the screw here to keep from marring up the finish on the pipe. Don't need it to be any worse than it already is. The top end of the standpipe isn't as critical as the bottom, although it does need to be somewhat less than 780 thousandths, which is the inside diameter of the start lever shaft. With both sides now approximately to their final dimensions, I can give this a quick test fit into the machine. The bottom end fits perfectly, although the top end, which wasn't as critical, is a little bit tight into the start lever shaft. I think I still need to take a little bit more off of it. Put it back into the lathe between the centers, so should give me the right concentricity. And I'm going to take off a few thousandths. I do have some room to play with here, although the inside diameter of the pipe limits me on how much I can take off. That's a really good fit. I think it's fitting perfectly as well as it can. I do have one more machining operation I have to take care of, so I have to take it back out and put it back into the lathe. Although this time I'm not going to be worrying about putting it back in the centers because I need access to the end of the bottom pipe. I need to thread this for 1/2 inch NPT. Using some copper jaws here to protect the pipe, and then I'm going to lock the lathe in back gear to keep the chuck from turning. I don't have a taper attachment, so I can't single point cut NPT threads. So I'm going to use a die, and the first thing I'm going to use here is a little bit of anchor lube on the pipe. I'll bring the die in, and I'm going to use the front of the drill chuck in the tailstock in order to keep pressure on the die while I turn it with a wrench. And of course this die is going nowhere. The pressure that I'm putting on with the tailstock is doing nothing more than push the pipe further into the chuck. And I don't think the die has even started to bite into this pipe yet. Well, I tightened down the chuck considerably, and now I'm finally getting a little bit of purchase with this die. Well, it's slow going, and hopefully I'll get enough threads on here that I can thread on the conduit adapter onto the pipe. This doesn't need to be a watertight seal, so I don't need the full depth of an NPT thread, just enough to hold that piece on. Well, the machining for the replacement standpipe is complete, and I think it came out great. Again, I think the surface finish could be miles better, but it's not going to get seen again after this video, so I'm fine with it. I'll deal with trying to improve that later. But I've got good dimensions, it's a good fit. I'm anxious to get it back into the machine. Well, I can get it back in the machine here. Even though I do trust the dimensions, I'm going to give myself a little bit of insurance. I'm going to put a little bit of RTV on the bottom end of the standpipe so that I am guaranteed to have a leak-proof connection. I can go ahead and get the rest of this put back together. The first thing I'm going to do is place this gear over top of the standpipe so I can bring the start lever shaft down and place it inside of the center bore and over the standpipe. I'm using a punch here to align the screw position with the notch that's in the lever shaft. I've got the screw started, and as awkward as it was to get out, it's equally as awkward to put back in. And it is important that I get this screw in all the way. So I am using a wrench on a square shafted screwdriver, because if this screw is too far out, it will interfere with the gears on the side of the transmission. I finished installing that gear and putting the transmission in off camera. I also reinstalled the motor pulley, and the drive belts. I filled the gearbox oil up to just about the high level. I didn't want to go any more than that. This will drop down a little bit during operation. I also put some oil absorbing mat around the motor just in case we have some other unseen catastrophic failure. Nothing left to do but to push the button. Well, I think that does it. It's been a couple of days since I shot this video, and we have had 0 leaks. Well, I think that does it for this week. And as always, thanks again for watching. Give the video a thumbs up. Subscribe if you're not a subscriber, and we'll see you on the next one.